Namaste. Jai Hind. Bharat Mata ki. Bharat Mata ki. Bharat Mata ki. I thank FISI UK for organizing this event and for giving me an opportunity to present my views from this prestigious platform. I'm grateful to the Nehru Centre Director, the Deputy Director, for collaborating with FISI UK for making this possible. I'm grateful for the presence of distinguished members of London, the Indian diaspora, Shri Nandakumar Garu, or Nandakumar Abare, the Director of Bhavans, and for all those who've managed to come on a weekday and were humble enough to actually occupy the steps. Thank you so very much. Means the world to me. The topic of reshaping India's global positioning is a subject on which people can actually write tomes and tomes, because I believe that this is the journey of Bharat's rediscovery of its own sense of self, both from an external perspective as well as an internal perspective. As a country and a society which was under the colonial yoke for close to 100 years, it's not 200 years. If people were to actually go through the dates, I managed to share the dates in a couple of speeches when I was here as part of the tour. India, as we know it, the entire landmass comes under the colonizer's yoke only in 1847 after the annexation of Sindh. Until then, they're still in the process of annexing Bharat. So strictly speaking, 1847 to 1947 is the period. Of course, starting from 1757 from the Battle of Plassey. I would divide Bharat's journey as the successor state to the Bharatiya civilization as a modern nation state from 1947 onwards in the following timelines. 1947 to 1975 would be the first timeline that I would look at. 1975 until 2000 or rather 1998 would be the second timeline. 98 to 2004, 2004 to 2014, and 2014 onwards is a different chapter altogether. The reason why I would focus on the first 30 years or so of Bharat's independent existence as a republic is that was the time we laid the foundations for several of our state institutions. We were presented with certain hard choices because that also coincided with the beginning of the Cold War, which presented a particularly ticklish situation for countries of the Asian continent, especially the colonized nations or countries which had achieved political independence in the 1940s, because they had to choose between one bloc or the other. And it was in that moment that Bharat as a fledgling nation chooses to actually occupy a center space or a space in the middle, which I think was perhaps gutsy and audacious, but in hindsight perhaps was premature. For the simple reason that you cannot afford to take these kind of positions unless and until you have some economic heft, something to offer of value. Nevertheless, for a country which was relatively fledgling and which was still trying to feed close to 36 crores of people, out of which the bulk of them were under, let's say they were reeling under severe conditions, it still had the originality to take a certain position which said neither the left nor the right and perhaps occupy a space in the middle. But 1947 to 1975, apart from the external challenges that Bharat faced, also presented a unique opportunity for Bharat from an internal perspective to strengthen, or rather to test the strength of its constitutional and democratic framework. A lot of people had actually written off this experiment called India in 1947 because never before had anyone attempted this kind of an experiment where a country, which is in fact a continent that masquerades as a country, with this kind of mind-boggling diversity, comes together to create a nation state. And I think we had an equal number of detractors and proponents who were curious to see this experiment either succeed or fail and falter. And I suspect the number of people who wanted it to fail was perhaps more. A lot of people believe that Bharat's democratic framework and its constitutional underpinnings are perhaps responsible for its success and its continued existence. I believe that two things went hand in hand. One, for good or bad, the new elites of Bharat who took over from the colonizer decided to adopt a certain policy of continuity to keep that particular state together. Because that experiment which the colonizer had started had managed to work itself out decently. And therefore in 1947 perhaps it made sense to continue with that particular policy of continuity until you had the ability to perhaps hit the reset button. So 1947 to 1975 onwards I would see, or until 1975, I would see this particular phase of Bharat's history as a period which was driven largely by necessity than by choice. And it is during this particular period, several of our state institutions were set up, from the Indian Institutes of Technology to the banking sector to heavy industries, so on and so forth, which in hindsight might militate against the grain of a capitalistic thought, so to speak, but have been significantly responsible for putting together a robust framework which has given employment to a lot of people, which has also ensured that the state invested in those sectors where private investment was not possible or the return on investment was not guaranteed. And three, when banks were nationalized, there was a huge flack and there was a lot of furor in India at that point, resulting in several constitutional challenges before the Supreme Court to the act of nationalization. But in retrospect, Bharat's nationalized banking sector has also been significantly responsible for shielding it and cushioning it from the shocks from the outside world, especially as the world got more interconnected thanks to globalization of markets. What I'm trying to perhaps say is that sometimes it's easy to get swayed by a political lens when you look at Bharat's history, but if you were to look at it in retrospect from an economic perspective, some of those decisions did indeed pay off and help us create a solid, stable framework, even if it were sluggish occasionally, for us to then open up the market as well as internal as well as external market for private innovation. Now, this is also one of those periods when Bharat perhaps significantly suffered from lack of originality because it followed a policy of continuity, both on the social sector level, at the education level, so on and so forth. To my mind, 1975 to 1977, although it's treated as perhaps one of the darkest phases of Indian constitutional history, exposed perhaps the brilliant phase of Bharat's democracy for the simple reason that post 1977 when the elections were conducted, this country showed that it had the ability to not dissipate under the weight of dictatorship. Constitutional institutions started responding and pushing back through judgments to preserve the basic fabric of the Constitution, known as the basic structure of the Constitution. And people responded in kind to those who had suspended the Constitution for 2.5 years. That was perhaps the time when people should have lost faith both in the Constitution, in constitutional institutions, as well as democracy. Instead, that happened to be one of those instances or milestones when the public's faith in each of these institutions was only strengthened and reinforced. And there is perhaps something to be said about the Indian society and state when you actually look at this particular period. Because as I've said before, Bharat is not held together by a document called the Constitution. It is fundamentally held together by civilizational unity and the values which come or emanate from that particular civilization, which have made it possible for it to succeed as a constitutional democracy when you look at the rest of the neighborhood around us, it tells you that it's not a document that is responsible for us surviving till date. It is the society that is responsible for us continuing to survive as a civilization and as a constitutional republic. Too often, I think, the Western lens focuses on institutions such as constitutional institutions without giving enough credit perhaps to the Indian society. Because if the document called the Constitution were the alpha and omega of ensuring democracy, and if it were a guarantee of democracy, then perhaps we should just look at the neighborhood that Bharat lives in. Despite the existence of a document called the Constitution, it's not as if they've been particularly great democratic successes. Therefore, while I don't think that the civilization alone should be given credit, because at the end of the day, the document and the civilization work hand in hand, it appears to be a fairly happy marriage and a fairly good handshake between the document and the society. Most importantly, I do believe that notwithstanding the picture of sometimes chaos that meets the Western eyes, I believe that it is a picture of vibrancy more than chaos, where institutions push back against each other to ensure that the balance of power is actually maintained between the three arms or the organs of the state, along with a fairly free and diverse fourth estate, namely the media. So much so that during the emergency, when there was a clampdown on free speech, the judiciary as well as the fourth estate rose up to the challenge to speak truth to power. And that tradition continues till date. 1975 to 1991, according to me, represents perhaps the next phase of Bharat's evolution as a nation state. Because voices other than the voices that inherited the, let's say, the independent fledgling nation state had started emerging on the political scene of Bharat, thereby representing a new voice, a fresh alternative, a new thought and a new direction, and a new option for the customer, namely the electorate or the voter. According to me, 1975 is when that journey began, when an alternative to the so-called mainstream political party and political ideology was presented to the public. All this while there was a fair diversity of political options, the Achilles heel for Bharat proved to be the lack of options on the economic front, because it continued to follow a closed economy, a licensed Raj, so to speak, which did not allow for the growth of the private sector and private initiative, which was unfairly dubbed as the Hindu rate of growth. 1991 was a fantastic turning point, although under dark circumstances when we were actually forced to open the markets. It showed two things. One, that the lack of private innovation until then, or at least the paucity of private innovation until then, was primarily because of self-imposed restrictions and not because of lack of an innovative tendency within the society. And once you opened it up, I would say 2025 from there was not far off and was not non-obvious for two reasons. One, from 1991 onwards, the rate of growth has only jumped and has remained stable and it is not plateaued. Two, with time and with more economic prosperity, Bharat also started asking significant social and cultural and civilizational questions of itself, which it did not have the luxury of asking prior to 1991. What I'm trying to say is perhaps if the experiment of 1991 had been undertaken in the 1970s or even in 1947, perhaps questions of decoloniality and civilizational pride that we're asking of ourselves post-2014 would have been asked at least by the 1960s or latest by the 1970s. Most importantly, on the foreign policy front, Bharat has always been accused of not having the ability or the guts to take a position and of being a cat on the fence, particularly on matters of international relations and on geopolitics, saying you don't wish to take a side. And I think to that, the current dispensation has given a fantastic answer. Bharat has always chosen a side. It is Bharat's side. We don't wish to be on the side of any particular ideology or a bloc. What has happened post 2014? Is it truly tectonic? Is it truly different? What marks it differently from the rest of the faces of Bharat? I am not going to say muscularity, I am going to say a calm sense of assertiveness. A composed sense of assertiveness, a certain degree of self-assuredness where you know who you are, or at least you've started asking yourself the right questions and you're hoping that the right answers present themselves. An explosion of voices on the social front, on the social cultural front. A fairly formidable challenge being presented to the status quo as it existed until 2014 on the worldview front and the civilisational front. So politics, society and foreign policy and economics have gone hand in hand since 2014, where Bharat does not believe that it must necessarily equate politeness with weakness and has decided to operate from the front foot. And has decided to assert itself on the table of big powers and has confidently asserted that as perhaps the oldest living and surviving civilization, it certainly has a lot more to offer to the global pool of thought as well as to global prosperity, with solutions to offer for global challenges such as climate change. In my view, the coming of age of Bharat is represented by the fact that it is no more trying to address the problems at home, it is also trying to address the problems of the world, and is presenting the best of options possible in a manner that is affordable, be it healthcare, be it space research, be it climate change, green technology, so on and so forth. Even in the period post 2014, I think the standout period has to be 2019 to 2025 for a specific reason. Because finally Bharat has decided to turn around and look squarely in the eye at the legacy issues that it has, or legacy challenges that it has inherited, and has decided to address them one by one. The CAA being perhaps one of those examples, the amendment, not abrogation of Article 370 being another. I would only request members of this audience, this knowledgeable audience, to go back and tell people that Article 370 was never abrogated. Abrogation means to excise out or to remove a particular provision from the book. It has never been abrogated, it has been amended. Because Article 370 continues to exist in the Constitution as it stands. So the amendment of Article 370, addressing certain civilizational disputes through the forum of the judiciary as opposed to resorting it on the streets or resolving it on the streets, and showing perhaps a way forward for truth and reconciliation through the highest constitutional forum of the land, namely the Supreme Court, with diverse voices populating that particular bench which delivered the verdict on the 9th of November 2019. Post 2019, once COVID hit the world, the test of Bharat as a society, the test of Bharat as an economy, the test of Bharat as a polity, all of which were tested, dare I say, I think Bharat came out with flying colours. For multiple reasons. One, it managed to offer homegrown solutions to the perhaps the largest, at this point I think the largest population in the world. Number two, it showed that it had the wherewithal to develop solutions from within without having to develop on the fall back on the West. Three, its economy managed to survive that scare, and we managed to secure our borders and defend our borders during that vulnerable period when faced with a challenge on the northeastern border. 5. Curiously, the lockdown also presented members of the Indian society with a fantastic opportunity to ask some hard questions of themselves as to who we are and where we come from. And in my view, the Indic Renaissance owes its origins not to 2014, but perhaps to the COVID period, which is when people started seeing an explosion of voices, thanks to people having the luxury of consuming those voices on YouTube. Don't you think so? And post 2020, if anything, Bharat has shown the confidence not just to succeed but also to absorb failures. And that, I think, is the true test of confidence. 2024, 2025 in particular, and perhaps the last 1 year, has shown that Bharat has finally developed the confidence to go it alone when it comes to important decisions, whether or not the world supports it. It has tried to play by the book when it comes to resolving certain outstanding issues, namely Kashmir, which according to us is not a dispute. It may be a dispute in the minds of someone else, but not us as far as we are concerned. It has chosen to abandon the good boy approach because clearly it has not paid off. And therefore it has said that we will resolve this matter on our own terms, in a manner of our choosing, at a time of our choosing, and we will not hold back anymore. In my view, while having taken the decision, Bharat has actually acted with a certain degree of restraint and maturity. It has meted out the lessons that were meant to be delivered to the aggressor, and it decided thus far and no further. And 3, it also decided to showcase its homegrown strengths in addressing that particular problem. From being perhaps the largest importer of arms and ammunition from the smallest of countries, it has now declared its ability to sell weapons to the biggest of nations and to the most powerful of nations. Should that be a matter of pride? In the world of a realist, absolutely yes. Perhaps in a pacifist utopia, the answer could be different, but we don't live in a pacifist utopian world. And therefore, I am certainly proud of the fact that Bharat has decided to showcase those abilities and has decided to actively engage with the rest of the world. The other thing that I think is of importance, which I think people are beginning to sit up and take notice, is that this country or rather the society has chosen to redefine certain terms and is not going to accept the glossary of definitions that has been bequeathed to it by the West. From definitions of development, to definitions of democracy, to free speech and whatnot, I think Bharat is evolving its own lexicon. While showcasing the fact that Bharat has the ability to occupy the table of big powers and engaging with modernity with a certain degree of confidence, it has also shown the rootedness to rediscover its roots and strike a balance between tradition and modernity without giving up one for the other. Because one tells you where you come from and the other decides where you will go. Both of them are equally important and both of them have to go hand in hand. So I think exciting times are ahead. The one aspect of Bharat's economic rise which I think is seldom given credit for by international platforms is the digital trifecta that it has come out with and the success with which it has been received by not just the urban population or the semi-urban population, but even the rural population. I can't think of any other jurisdiction or any other country where at this scale the UPI or Aadhaar or any other layer which was meant for digital payments would have met with this kind of resounding success. What that also tells you is that the myth of snake charmer was never true in the first place. Because the native intelligence of the average Bharatiya has always been underestimated by the outsider. importance has been given to the ability to speak in Queen's English. Or the King's English. We finally have a head of state who is comfortable speaking in a Bharatiya language on international platforms. Who has a civilizational confidence to actively pitch for its soft power from the highest office of the land, highest executive office of the land. I don't think you should judge Bharat's success by the success of its metropolitan cities or the English-speaking elites. You should perhaps go to the tier 2 and tier 3 cities and you realize the sheer confidence of people coming from those parts of the country who don't or who cannot speak a sentence in English, and they don't need to, and they still speak the language of innovation, entrepreneurship, and building of private capital. That, I think, perhaps is where the actual Bharat story lies. As part of this journey, according to me, what stands out and which is a crucial element of Bharat's foreign policy and perhaps even the domestic policy is that there was a point when India's diaspora were perhaps treated like destitutes, who did not feel the connection from the Indian state and who did not ever know whether the Indian state would stand up for them and reach out to them in times of trouble. But since 2014, I think a switch has been flipped on that front. And I can confidently say that the diaspora feels more Bharatiya since 2014, is much more confident straddling both the boats in terms of dual identities, and 3, knows that the mothership is constantly looking out for them in the event of trouble or otherwise. And 4, the mothership is conscious of your strategic presence and value, which has been, according to me, underused until 2014. So, perhaps, if you look at it from a panoramic perspective, 2014 onwards, I think the stars have aligned to herald, according to me, the Bharatiya age. It will take some time because the challenges are not small, and the challenges are not small even in terms of magnitude, forget just the numbers. But according to me, that's a very good thing. I don't think Bharat should hope for a meteoric rise because in the fall would be equally meteoric. Bharat should aspire to address its problems step by step. And that also means that it presents a fantastic economic opportunity for the rest of the world because this growth story will not conclude in 5 or 10 years, but will go on for at least 35 to 40 years. And this model of development, I think, is going to be an important lesson because every time a country or a state chooses the path of meteoric rise on the economic front, nature pays the price. And therefore, Bharat's ability to consume and digest gradually will also be a lesson in terms of sustainable development and consumption with restraint. That, I think, is going to be one of the biggest lessons that Bharat's rise will have for the rest of the world. Finally, to all the publications here and broadcasting corporations here and on the other side of the Atlantic, I have a subtle message, or perhaps a not so subtle message. You don't need to teach us diversity. You don't need to teach us free speech, and you certainly don't need to teach us the value of democracy. These are values which we take for granted and we have grown up with. If anything, Bharat shall hopefully be in a position to teach the rest of the world the ability to coexist with multiple identities, including perhaps diametrically opposite identities or belief systems. That, I think, will be the lesson that Bharat will have to offer. But the path to that particular destination is not going to be easy, nor do I see that happening anytime in the future, in the near future at the very least. I think this will take at least 25 to 30 years. Between now and then, I suspect this will be a particularly volatile age where Bharat's resolve and will to reach its own goals will be tested by everyone who is interested in watching it fall, fail, and falter. This will be the time when indices of free speech and democracy will be used against us. Our models of development will be questioned. The fundamental values which we hold dear as a civilization will be called into question, ridiculed, and mocked. And we will see the veneer and facade of sophistication go aside and the true colors come out. The true colors will emerge. And I suspect they will emerge in your adopted homelands. So perhaps you must steel yourself and build stronger bonds with the mothership and stand your ground here, because you have contributed to the growth of each of your adopted homelands with confidence and with conviction, and by being model law-abiding citizens. You have no reason to worry. You should not be worried. If anything, I would only urge members of the diaspora to actively work with organizations such as FISI UK to strengthen your roots, to make your voices heard in all platforms, and to make sure that your presence in public spaces and political spaces are not pixelated. If anything, it must only rise and increase. Because when the good people keep silent and stay aside, we know who will take over. And therefore, I think Bharat as an obligation, and Bharatiya diaspora has certainly the obligation of ensuring that the first world apparatus remains in the hands of law-abiding people and not those who wish to subvert those values, use those values to further the voices of tyranny and fascism of any hue or any shade. With this, I invite the audience to participate in this Mahayagni called Bharat, contribute to the best of your abilities, make sure that you become ambassadors of the Bharatiya story in letter, spirit, and action, and make sure that successive generations continue to remember that the umbilical cord goes back to Bharat, and there must be mutual investment from the state, the Indian state, into its diaspora and the other way around. This is the time for us to come together to present a united voice as Indians, as Bharatiyas. Should we fight fratricidal language wars at this time, or indulge in divisive identity politics at this point? The propagandists will get away. And perhaps that portal that has opened in the annals of time to finally carve out the Bharat story and to usher the age of Bharat, we would have lost it, and perhaps for good. So we should perhaps act with a certain sense of urgency, with a certain sense of purpose, and make sure that we do not let this opportunity pass. And importantly, for youngsters in the diaspora, I would urge you to take an active interest in Bharat as well as in your adopted homelands, and try and present Bharat's story in your respective spaces. And therefore, the diaspora has an obligation to create the fallback mechanisms in terms of institutional mechanisms to ensure that your children don't feel isolated and alone in college spaces and school spaces. Because that's where the problem starts and then it continues. Assume for a moment that you're patriotic and you still have faith in Bharat and you continue to associate yourself with the Bharatiya identity. The investment of the opposite side is in the mind spaces of your children, because that is the battleground. That is the all-important battleground, because they know for a fact that perhaps they have lost the narrative of the present, therefore their investment is in the future. It's in tomorrow. So I think with this sense of vigilance and sense of purpose, I think we must act. I'm open to questions. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
The Bharat legacy and the modern. So India is often celebrated as the largest democracy, but not always as the most understood one. How would you define the Indian democratic model, and in what ways does it differ fundamentally from the Western one?
First of all, I don't know what to make of the audience's silence. It's mighty convenient for us to think it's complementary in nature. Coming to the question of Bharat's democracy and how is it different from the model of the West. Perhaps the skeletal structure of Bharat's democracy as it stands is largely similar to the model that's followed here. With the primary distinction being that in this country, the constitution is supreme and the power of judicial review is significantly truncated. Plus, it doesn't have a written constitution. But as far as India is concerned, the decisions taken by the parliament as well as the executive can constantly be challenged before the judiciary, or even by the judiciary sometimes through suo motu actions. Now, I don't know whether this is good or bad, but what it does certainly tell you is that Bharat has evolved a certain mechanism where, despite it being a democracy, an unelected body has been given the power by the constitution to rein in an elected body. This, I think, is one of the standout features of Bharat's democracy. Now, this feature is perhaps one of the most contested features because it is the subject of a debate, a lot of argument as to whether this is even permissible. Because if the unelected body decides to run amok, then it can constantly create hurdles in the path of decision making. It can make development slow and sluggish. Nevertheless, I think the experience has been, and Bharat's particular experience has been, that it is this unelected body which has also been responsible for stopping tyranny in its tracks, for stopping people with dictatorial tendencies in their tracks, and for reinforcing faith in the concept of justice in the minds of the average public. I'll give you a simple example. I think there is no other jurisdiction, and perhaps a jurisdiction of a comparable scale, where the judiciary decided to treat petitions and letters, or rather plain and simple letters written to the Chief Justice of India or to judges of the Supreme Court as petitions by themselves, and act on those petitions. In that sense, it is what we call epistolary jurisprudence, where letters have been treated as petitions, and the Supreme Court has created several fundamental rights and carved out several due process principles on the basis of such petitions. Seldom have we actually given credit for it, because at a time when the average public is generally poor or it does not have access to justice, as opposed to occupying the ivory towers of courts, it shows that notionally speaking, the courts have come down to the level of the average man and decided to dispense justice in a manner he understands. So that, I think, is one of the stellar features of Bharat's jurisprudence. Second, in terms of our policy making, the one feature which I think is deeply problematic and that needs to be addressed significantly, maybe we have done it to some extent, but we need to go a step further, is when it comes to policy making, by and large, we have actually looked to other jurisdictions before formulating our own solutions. Perhaps we need to invert that model a bit, wherein you look for solutions within. If there are no solutions within to a particular problem, then you look for inspiration outside. And even when you look for inspiration outside, don't implement the model as is where is. You will have to customize it to the local conditions. That perhaps is where typically I push my agenda of decolonization on the policy making front. So I'll give you a simple example. Even in matters of judicial, let's say, adjudication of matters, there has been a marked tendency to look to the West, either to the United States or to UK, for judgments on certain advanced subjects, as opposed to asking for themselves, what is it that we should do when we are presented with the legislation? In the sense, let's take intellectual property as an example. It's not as if Bharat does not have its own legal framework for protection and enforcement of intellectual property. Despite having a legislation or a series of enactments on sensitive areas, on the interpretation of those legislations, Bharat still looks to the United States and United Kingdom in interpreting its homegrown legislations. This, I think, is a remnant and a legacy of a colonial hangover. So, as much as I would want to present a picture of complete decolonization by the Indian state, the fact of the matter is we are still a mixed bag when it comes to this. And this feature, according to me, will have to be addressed as quickly as possible, because experience shows that some of the examples and initiatives that we've taken from abroad have not actually worked on the ground. A stark example, in my view, would be, why should we continue to treat English as the primary medium of transaction of Indian courts? Is that something that has actually worked itself out? This is something that is fairly doable. This is something that we can actually consider. In that sense, it takes you to a different argument altogether. I'll just take 30 seconds more. Bharat should not see itself as a monolithic state. For all practical purposes, it has more diversity than Europe. So when it comes to its language policy, it should not adopt a monolithic policy or a monochromatic policy. It must actually actively consider transacting its official business in more than one language on a regular basis. That, according to me, would actually solve a lot of our problems when it comes to ensuring that our public understands that it is not dealing with an anglicized apparatus, it is actually dealing with an Indian apparatus. Whether it is the bureaucracy or the judiciary, this I think is an important thing, because most people don't approach courts, even if they have some, let's say, grievances to redress, because they believe that it is the enclave of the blue bloods and the English-speaking elites. This I think I've seen particularly in my profession. So these are certain standout features, both the positives and the minuses when it comes to the Indian system on the policy making front and the justice dispensation front, which I think we need to address seriously.
There are many questions actually, just I have tried to combine all together on the India economy and the global power. So there are two parts. I think the second one seems like at least 5 and 6 people have asked, so we'll take the second one. And seems like the diaspora feel that also. India's rise as an economic power is now hard to ignore. How is the Western world responding to this ascent? Do you observe recognition, resistance, or recalibration, and how should India navigate that perception?
So there are two ways of going about this. One, the Chinese model has been to ignore what the West has to say. It doesn't care. It just doesn't care. And for some reason, by and large, for the most part, the Indian state has behaved like a typical Indian middle class family. Char log kya kahenge? I am not someone who's going to subscribe to the Chinese extreme, because as the events of the Middle East will tell you, winning the narrative war is important. You can't completely ignore it. You want people to know that justice is on your side and you're the one who's been attacked. Public perception should not dictate our strategic choices and the decisions that we take to address our problems. But having taken those decisions, we must certainly reach out to the rest of the world to explain our position to them. That's the difference. If public perception becomes the starting point to reverse engineer the solution of the decision, that's where the problem starts. Instead, you address the problem and announce to the rest of the world your position with a certain degree of clarity and conviction, which I think you've done. And this approach or this change of position and policy by Bharat, I think the West finds fairly unpalatable, because they're used to a much more supine Bharat. Let's call it a supine India. And where we have our ambassadors or let's say our foreign policy faces speak in reverential tones to the West. That is no more the policy according to me. We don't adopt an arrogant approach, but we certainly say this is our position. We invite you to understand it. But should you choose not to understand it, we will not try and seek your validation. 3, even when it comes to some of its own domestic issues or domestic policy issues, for a very long time, Bharat has been afflicted by what would the New York Times say or what would the BBC say. I think that problem continues to some extent still. In the sense, there is a marked mismatch between the confidence with which Bharat responds to or ignores these voices on the foreign policy front, but is somehow concerned about what they have to say when it comes to our domestic issues. So there is some gap here, and there is some kind of cognitive dissonance on the subject. I hope we actually address this gap, and the confidence with which we show or with which we address our external challenges should also be reflected in addressing our internal legacy issues. Because at the end of the day, some of the decisions that we have to take to address the civilizational problems may not be acceptable to people in the West, but the lived experience of the West and its history are different from us. You really are in no position to compare your histories with us. You are in no position to compare yourself with the neighborhoods you live in and the neighborhoods that you are forced to live in. It's perfectly fine for a country which is surrounded by water bodies on both sides, with practically no borders to share, and the borders that it shares are of people who are client states, right? To speak of free speech, to speak of engagement, to speak of whatnot. But when you live in a hostile neighborhood such as Bharat, there are things that we have to do which you may not understand or like, but that should not be a problem anymore. In that sense, I think Bharat has shown a certain degree of vertebracy. We will have to display that vertebracy even more in the coming times, because I suspect that the challenges will only increase. And along with that, the shrillness with which we are attacked by the West will increase. But there is something interesting about what is happening in the West. The West has 2 different sets of voices, rather 3 different sets of voices. The voice of the state apparatus, the voice of the society, and third is the voice of experts coming from within the civil society of the West. The state apparatus may constantly take a position that is inimical to us. But if we invest in the Western society and civil society experts within the society, I suspect we are bound to find a lot more friends and allies and people who understand our point of view. A case in point would be of subject matter experts coming out in defense of Bharat and explaining what we have actually achieved in Operation Sindoor. When the state governments and state parties have taken a diametrically opposite position, the voices within the society are taking a position that is at loggerheads with the state's position. And I think it is time we exploited that distinction, because so far that's what they've done with us. So clearly, when you're looking at voices from the West, we must junk the idea that there is only one voice coming out, or it is a monolithic representation. It's not. So maybe we should invest and cultivate allies in those sections of the Western society, is how I would see it.
Thank you, Sandeep. I think the one question already you answered it. Maybe in 30 seconds, if you want to just add some but how do we tackle the misinformation by the Western media? I think it's more or less how do we tackle the misinformation by the Western media? Actually, I think you have covered, but anything if you want to please answer.
So, I do believe that if we have to take the example of Operation Sindoor and what we have done post that, the sending out of an all-party delegation or a non-partisan delegation to the rest of the world to present a position is a fantastic initiative, which also shows that notwithstanding the fissures within or the differences within, when it comes to issues of national security, we are capable of speaking in one voice. That's a brilliant message to send. And I can't think of any example in recent history where any other country has actually done this. So I think this is a brilliant example. Two, it shows immense maturity and generosity of heart and an understanding of strategy on the part of the Indian state and the dispensation at this point. to draw from talent wherever it exists, regardless of the party it comes from. That is tremendous sign of maturity. 3. At this point, I would have expected the Indian state to also tap into the voices in the diaspora, to fall back on them, to reach out to their local representatives, to present their version of the story, which I think has happened in this country. I just hope that, or I wish it had actually happened with a greater degree of urgency, and it should not have been limited only to those places where the diaspora itself has taken the initiative to present Bharat's position. Bharat as a state and as a society must actively engage with its diaspora to constantly counter the misinformation campaign for one good reason. I'll explain this. Language, idiom, filters of political correctness change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, country to country. What is acceptable in public discourse in India may not be acceptable in UK or in the United States. Therefore, you need people from each of these regions to speak in a language that the local audience understands, so that our position is presented in the best possible way in a manner that the local audience understands. I'll give you a simple example. I recently learned that George Orwell loved Manchester for a reason, and he also said that Britishness and true English culture does not reside in the elites, but actually resides in the working class. That was his belief. And he said, if you want to understand Britishness, you must live among them to make sense of Britishness. So if you were to apply the lens of the present to what Orwell had to say, he did take a pro-nativist position. I would want to use an Orwellian lens to present the nativist view of Bharat, to explain our position when it comes to decolonization, so that they understand. If you're perfectly comfortable celebrating the position of Orwell, where he celebrates the indigenous identity, why do you have a problem with Bharat reclaiming its indigenous identity? That is the kind of parallel that I would draw. In other words, Bharat's journey of decolonization can be given an Orwellian twist, and that's something that you must try in different jurisdictions, using examples and, let's say, experiences from the pop culture of each of those jurisdictions to present a point of view. 3, we have allowed too many people to let away, or rather to get away with the comparison of Pakistan with Palestine and Kashmir with Gaza. These false parallels need to be addressed as quickly as possible, because India may ally with a certain country to address a shared interest or to address a common problem, but that doesn't mean the histories are the same and the motivations are the same. This dehyphenation of interest from history is crucial, because if you don't do that, our children and our students will face repercussions on campuses, which I don't want. I don't want our students to be targeted merely because there is some kind of an alliance between India and another country for a strategic reason. And our causes should not be dubbed or should not be viewed through the same lens as another cause in the Middle East, because we have our own experience. It takes away the legitimacy of our cause. It undermines our problems and the true victimization that we have been subjected to. If anything, should I drop this time? I'll leave it for some other controversial forum.
Yeah, let's move to the next one. Okay, so
we'll speak to move to the next question.
I think probably I will answer a question from Saurabh, because you cover Pakistan. What would be your thought about taking back the UK? I think, Saurabh, if you are okay, we'll leave that for Modi ji and Amit Shah ji. We'll move to the next one. Diversity and dialogue, and there are 4 or 5 questions on this, especially on the India diversity. Obviously, it's unparalleled, but the question is, what mechanism within our democratic system do you believe best protect this plurality, and what more needs to be done?
If we do more, it will get chaotic. I think we should leave it at this. See, one of the things that you end up asking yourself if you're not a populist is, when you choose to celebrate a particular value, you must explain the intrinsic worth of the value. Let's assume for a moment you wish to celebrate free speech. Explain why is free speech inherently good. Similarly, if you choose to celebrate diversity, explain why diversity is inherently good. I would proceed with the position, and hopefully a calibrated position, whether it's politically correct or not, that you need not place a premium on diversity in every situation to address every problem. Where it makes sense to have a representation from a rainbow of voices to address problems which affect them differently, diversity becomes relevant then. But if a certain problem requires application of mind and talent and merit in the first place, then that must prevail over any considerations of diversity. 3. In my view, in the last few years, thanks to a wave of ultra-political correctness, an uber, let's say, emphasis on DEI has also percolated Indian policy-making apparatus, which I'm not sure is particularly good. Because it has come at the expense of efficiency, it has come at the expense of the speed with which you take a decision. Respect diversity to ensure that nobody is left out of a particular conversation, for sure. Make sure that their presence in public spaces and political spaces are recognized so that their specific concerns are addressed. But if you choose to make diversity the be-all and end-all of a particular conversation, then the problem-solution approach which should inform your approach to a particular situation will take a back seat because you're trying to cater to an audience as opposed to addressing a problem. In my view, inherently Bharat has tried to make sure that its languages are sufficiently represented in public fora, genders are sufficiently represented in public fora, different identities in terms of faith systems are represented in public fora. What more can Bharat do? It's not possible for Bharat to find a place for every voice because in the real world, particularly in the world of policy making, you sometimes have to approximate. But not every approximation comes from a place of malicious motivation where you're trying to cut out a particular identity. We have the luxury of celebrating diversity because we do not have the obligation of taking a decision or crafting a policy. We don't understand what goes on behind the scenes to craft a particular policy. So to the extent that we want policy making to be fair, it is right on our part to expect diversity to be a relevant consideration. But beyond that, I think if you wish to foist diversity as the sole metric on which you judge the fairness of the decision-making process, that would reflect a certain degree of unrealism. In the process, the society will take a hit, and it will seem as if an elitist concern has prevailed over realist concerns of people who are struggling for food, water, and the basics. I'll give you an example just so that people understand what I'm saying. When Aadhaar was sought to be introduced in the Indian system, so that there is a point of convergence which helps the government make payments across the board and use it as a way of facilitating government transactions and to prevent, let's say, corruption thanks to middlemen in between, several challenges had been filed before the Supreme Court of India challenging the constitutionality of Aadhaar. I was one of those people who basically said, retain Aadhaar but strengthen the system to ensure that it does not fall in the hands of illegal migrants who choose to use Aadhaar as a means of identification to have access to state resources. It just so happens that over the last 10 or 15 years, my fears have come true. But the other side of the coin is, the ones who wanted to challenge Aadhaar did not do it to prevent the document from being used by illegal migrants, but did so to prevent, or rather to protect, the private rights of privacy of those people who did not have food or water access to state resources. Which I felt was a fairly elitist concern. At which point I think fortunately the Supreme Court highlighted this very clearly, that the concerns of the metropolitan, let's say, of the metros are not the concerns of the villages and districts. And if we approach human rights exclusively through the lens of the welfare and the affluent, then you're doing grave injustice to those people who are still in the line waiting for basic delivery of services. Which is why I believe that excessive emphasis of diversity perhaps has a certain degree of insensitive elitism, pardon me for saying so, which needs to take a backseat, grow some humility, and realize that there are concerns other than diversity as well.
Thank you, Sai. Just we'll take a couple of more questions. Okay. So seems like people are looking for all the solutions from you. So the another one is the youth and leadership. With India being one of the youngest countries in the world, what role should be the youth playing in strengthening the democratic value while engaging with the global institutions?
Perhaps India's youth must take a leaf out of the Western experience and not follow it. Which is, as the country grows more prosperous in material terms, there is a marked disaffection in the youth when it comes to participating in the democratic process. They grow distant from elections. They find for themselves comfortable cocoons in which they reside, and they have no interest in what happens outside of that. And they have no interest in a certain sense of civic service, which I think explains what's happening in the West, which explains why they have such poor outcomes when it comes to elections, in terms of voter turnouts. I genuinely hope Bharat and its youth do not make the very same mistake. And they realize that if we do not participate in the process and we do not turn up in significant numbers, then the quality of the process and the options of the choices it throws up as a society automatically take a hit. Who would have thought at some point that the choices that we were faced with, or America was faced with in 2024, would have actually, what are the quality of choices according to me? They were abysmal. I'm sorry to say this. I don't think the American public was presented with the best of choices on either sides. But this is not an overnight development. This is significantly the product of gradual disaffection on the part of the electorate with the electoral process and with politics in general. So our challenge will be to continue to retain the interest of our youth in the political process, in the process of governance and administration, as we grow more affluent and as we succeed more on material terms. That's going to be our challenge. Because look at it this way, when you're poor, they look for greener pastures outside, and when you're affluent, they disconnect with the system within. So it's a catch-22, heads I win, tails you lose. So you have to find a way to address this particular problem for a good reason, that if thinking, educated people who are capable of taking good decisions take a back seat, then at the end of the day, every vote will be sold for a packet of biryani and a bottle of alcohol. This can happen when you're poor, and it can equally happen when you become rich. In both these extremes it's possible, then the vote becomes a saleable commodity and a transferable commodity in that sense. So I think that's going to be a challenge.
Okay, probably last question, but in Manchester yesterday we have seen the host or moderator in the name of last question. He asked how many questions? 5 questions.
3 last questions.
Okay, so this one is the last one. If we were to project India 25 years into the future, what would be the global influencer, culturally rooted Indian democracy look like in your vision?
I think Bharat would have redefined the word superpower. On humbler lines, without the hubris that is currently associated with the word and the entity occupying that space. Two, I genuinely hope Bharat will take the lead, not in being the global policeman or policewoman as the case may be, but in taking a lead in addressing the problems of the world. Because I don't think we are going to be faced with problems which are localized anymore. And as someone who's an avid watcher of climate change, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. And if we are looking at a timeline 25 years hence, I don't know what we're going to be looking at, from water shortages to whatnot, and maybe an aging population. We could be looking at a lot of issues. I'm not trying to present a gloomy picture, I'm just saying that with power comes responsibility. These are the challenges which already exist on the table. And therefore, as we rise, we have to continue to find answers to each of these challenges. 3, I hope Bharat will present a decolonized version of itself which is not xenophobic in nature, or ethnocentric in nature, or racist in nature. I hope Bharat would have taught a lot of aggressive voices which are constantly looking to create trouble the need to stay calm and pipe down. And Bharat would have presented itself as a microcosm of the world in terms of being an example for peaceful coexistence. These, I think, would be my expectations of Bharat, where the state is humane enough to reach out to the last person in the last mile, and it doesn't become a multinational corporation for the elite and the affluent, which I think is perhaps the problem that the country on the other side of the Atlantic faces.
Okay, so thank you, Saiji. And this one is the definitely last one. On this subject particularly, just I want you to summarize, and this is not question, this is probably call for action for the diaspora, if you want.
I don't have any more messages to offer except for a simple request that we have entered exciting times, in my view. I'm happy that I'm part of this generation when Bharat is finally hopeful of its future and its present. Generations of Bharatiyas have toiled away to finally give us this day. We stand on the shoulders of such faceless, nameless people, especially those who came to this country or to the United States at a time when Bharat was not exactly a pinnacle of, or let's say, was not exactly an example of material prosperity. I said this yesterday at Manchester, I'll repeat it here for abundant consumption. I'm grateful to the diaspora, the Bharatiya diaspora, for retaining its Bharatiyata at a time when Bharat was not exactly a shining beacon of prosperity. I'm sure it wouldn't have been easy at all one bit, because it's easy to be confident of Bharat in 2025 as opposed to 1975 or 1965. So to that generation, I'm grateful. And I'm grateful to them also for having ensured that they've passed on the identity and the cultural confidence to the next generation. 3, I would only request that you invest in this journey of Bharat, make yourself count. Again, I've said this before, I'll repeat it here. In a good way, you need Bharat today more than Bharat needs you. Which is perhaps what we were always hoping for. Nevertheless, I don't think your presence in this equation has become redundant. You still remain relevant. And you have the ability to create impact, particularly when we are going to be faced with a lot of misinformation and propaganda. So please dig in your heels, entrench yourself, strengthen your local positions, and make sure that you count, or rather Bharat can fall back on you to present its message in each of these jurisdictions without compromising on your loyalty to your adopted homelands while remaining within the bounds of the law. Thank you.